Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Prosper Tettey Doe in the United Kingdom. This presentation is the second episode of Africa Speaks, the World Listens, which is excerpts from the book, The Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Tettey Browder. And I'd like you to journey with me, even as I go through this very important series. And the summary in this presentation will cover pilgrims, slavery impact, racism, African contribution to world progress, the birthplace of civilization, and then finally, scholars and biases. First is pilgrims. Many African Americans travel to Africa not as tourists, but as pilgrims in search of the missing pages of their history. And the history of Africa and African people is a story which has been denied, distorted, and often presented as other people's history. Ladies and gentlemen, when African Americans travel and visit Egypt, it is not only the fulfillment of a dream, but for many, it is often a life-changing experience. Now, let's look at the next, which is the impact of slavery. Just imagine this scenario. How would you feel if your ancestors, name the country, for example, Egyptian ancestors had been enslaved by Americans 300 years ago, displaced from their homelands, given new names, denied the right to speak Arabic or their local language, practice their native customs, and worship their God. Ask yourself to imagine now these people, their descendants, returning to their homelands in an attempt to reconstruct their history, their culture, language, and religion, only to discover that the Americans now controlled their land. To make matters worse, these same Americans have also written Egyptians out of their own history and replaced them with a history of Americans or other peoples. Over the last decade, thousands of African Americans who have traveled to Africa have become acutely aware that the hypothetical scenario which I've just outlined is a reality for people of African descent. Any culturally orphaned people would delight at the prospect of uncovering the smallest fragments of their historical past. Passion, enthusiasm, and anger are just some of the emotions felt when people begin to come face to face with formerly hidden truths. And this has been the case for more than 350 years. Tens of millions of Africans were torn away from their homeland, enslaved, and systematically stripped of their name, their culture, their historical memory, And today, thousands of African Americans are awakening from a state of cultural amnesia and are discovering that Africans possessed a mighty history prior to their enslavement and colonization. Now let's look at racism, which is the third I would like to mention. The role racism played and continues to play in shaping world history is a tragedy which negatively influences all people. There are those who are correct in their belief that the race issue is irrelevant and is an impediment to human development. In reality, there is only one race, that is the human race, which has been proven to have originated in Africa. Yet, for years, scientists have ignored and even fabricated data to show that humanity developed in Europe or Asia, rather than acknowledge Africa as the site where the greatest evidence of early human development is to be found. Now, let's look at the African contribution to world progress. But before then, I would like to mention on the African origins of humanity in relation to this African contributions to world progress. Regarding these African origins of humanity, Dr. Louis B. Leakey, one of the world's foremost paleontologists and author of Progress and Evolution of Man in Africa, stated, "In every country that one visits and where one is drawn into a conversation about Africa, the question is regularly asked by people who should know better. But what has Africa contributed to world progress?" Now hold this question. The assertion that Africa was the birthplace of man and civilization is correct. It is generally an accepted fact that the primary implements necessary for the development of civilization, for example, an alphabet, paper, pen, and ink, all had their beginnings in Africa. Writing is an art form which we often take for granted, but its profound influence on the evolution of civilization was noted by James Breasted, famed Egyptologist and author of Ancient Times. The invention of writing and of a convenient system of records on paper has had a greater influence in the uplifting of the human race than any other intellectual achievement in the career of man. It was more important than all the battles ever fought and all the constitutions ever devised. Now, I'd like us even to look at the birthplace of civilization. In that respect, let's see Africa as the origin of humanity. And when one visits Africa, one knows that, yes, the critics of Africa forgot that men of science today are, with few exceptions, satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself, and that for many hundreds of centuries thereafter, Africa was in the foremost of world progress. Now, let's look at scholars and biases. The scholar consolidates and clarifies the knowledge which has already been acquired and hands it to the scientist who, thus provided, proceeds to experiment, and thus to the increase of knowledge. Without the touch of learning, the scientist is reduced to groping in the dark, and without the scientist to use and test the results of the learning, the scholar sinks into a barren pedantry. Thus, scholarship and science, in the widest sense of these terms, are the warp and wool of civilization, and the scientist, no less than the scholar, is dependent upon the written word. Not only must he be able to use the learning of the scholar, but he must be able to record the results of his own investigations. So the scholar and the scientist go side by side to complement each other. But now let's look at the biases. Now, unfortunately, in recent years, racism has played a major role in determining how people of color will be portrayed in the writing of the history of the world. Scholars and scientists were sometimes employed by politicians and businessmen and paid to exaggerate the historical accomplishments of Europeans at the expense of most people of color. The many biases which exist in the scientific and academic community have prompted the following remarks from attorney and historian Legrand Clerk, and I quote, "As long as the world is dominated by white people, as long as those white scientists who now claim that there is no validity to the study of race continue to practice racism socially and academically, and most important, as long as the Black race bears the universal badge of inferiority forced upon it by scientists who have distorted or suppressed Black history, we shall prominently focus on it whenever and wherever the truth can be told, until sincere men of science return the Black race to its former position of respect and reverence on the earth." So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of this episode, and we'll continue with episode 3 in the next series. Thank you for your attention, and God bless our homeland, Africa, and all Africans in the diaspora.